I mean, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or somewhere in between, I want to make sure that you have the ability to cast a ballot if you're an eligible Montana voter. I'm Bryce Bennett, state senator from Senate District 50, which is central and southern Missoula. Been serving the legislature since 2011, so just about a decade now, and was the youngest member of the legislature when I first got elected back at that point. I got elected when I was 25 years old, and now 10 years later, I am a little bit older than that. But I've been working on voting rights issues for a very long time now, even before my time in the legislature, and it is certainly the great passion of my life.
Segue into what the main focus of this is about felon voting rights in Montana and throughout the course of the country. So I'll kind of introduce you to the 5 policy steps that our professor Paul LaChapelle told us about, kind of like the steps of the policy. So the first one is the problem, issue, and identification. So I think that one is pretty self-explanatory. I think voting rights for everyone, and that includes people who may be in jail, who may be out of jail, kind of all around that is the problem issue. And people view that problem issue differently depending on how they feel about felons voting. The second step is to objectify, kind of see the policy objectives and the stakeholders to that policy. So I'd love for you to talk about kind of who are the people impacted by this policy and what are their objectives in it.
So you're wondering who would be impacted by, people being able to vote who've been involved with the justice system?
Yep. So kind of who's impacted by different policies on felon voting rights.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously people who have committed felonies, are the core of that. But I mean, certainly their friends, their families, their communities, and certainly, I mean, I think it really does stretch out to our democracy as a whole. I mean, as I was saying before, as I think I said in another meeting that I had earlier today, or maybe in committee or the floor, I mean, it's all kind of blending together at this point. But our democracy is strongest when everybody that is eligible to vote is casting a ballot. And certainly, whether it's this specific segment or some other segment of the voting population that isn't having their voice heard, our democracy is hurt because of it. So, I do think that this is a larger issue than just these specific folks being able to cast a ballot. I think it's about making sure that the voting populace is representative of the vast array of diverse voter segments that are existing here in Montana.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I don't think it's just the felons who are stakeholders in this. I think it's their communities, their families, their interests, and everything about that.
Yeah. Well, and another thing, I mean, so I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and we don't talk about voting issues much. I mean, but we do talk about people who get involved with the justice system quite a bit. And when we're talking about rehabilitation and making sure that we don't have recidivism or people, returning to jail who've been there before or to prison, one of the important things is giving people some of that normalcy back, giving them pieces of their life that give them purpose and meaning once again. I mean, things like housing, things like a job, but also making sure that they get to reintegrate into society and feel like they are full members once again. And voting is a big piece of that. That's a core thing that, makes us Montanans, makes us Americans, makes us part of this important democracy. So it goes beyond just, it'd be a nice token thing to give people. It actually plays an important role in making sure that we don't have people finding their way back into the prison system.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think treating ex-felons like the humans they are goes a long way with rehabilitation.
Absolutely.
Moving on to the next part of this is the policy strategy and effects. So I'll give a brief introduction to what the Republican governor of Iowa has done. So Iowa before this, they did not allow any ex-felons to vote, no matter if you're on parole, probation, still in jail. And to be able to get those voting rights back, you had to petition the governor, and then they would decide how that was handled. And the governor recently signed into an executive order guaranteeing voting rights for everyone who has served their time. And for Iowa, that includes probation and parole. So you cannot vote during either one of those, but you can vote after you finish both of those. Um, so yeah, like how do you feel about the strategy of using this executive order to implement the voting rights as opposed to doing something like a constitutional amendment or a legislative bill?
Yeah, I mean, I guess most importantly is that the policy changes, and it changes as soon as can possibly be done. Um, Montana, we are lucky in the fact that we've been ahead of the curve on this issue for as long as I've known. I mean, in Montana, as soon as you leave the prison system, as soon as you're no longer incarcerated, whether you're on probation or parole, you are able to register and vote and participate just like you were able to do beforehand. And I think that's the right thing to do. I mean, I think that, we believe in the concept that, there's a debt that needs to be paid to society, but when it is paid, you get to enter society and you get to, you know, do everything that you could before. I mean, obviously there's still some restrictions that may come with, probation or parole or other things a judge may provide, but the day you walk out of the prison, you're able to register to vote and once again have your say because this is your state just as much as anyone else. But I guess I'm happy for what's happening in Iowa, but I think that we all know that the tough thing about executive orders is that an ex-governor can just toss it in the trash and say, well, I don't believe that anymore. And, I think having something that is durable, that will remain the law, that will be a full-scale change that sticks around forever is obviously the stronger way to go. But nonetheless, I'm glad that for the time being, it's being addressed. Having that fundamental basis of a clear right to vote in all these constitutions would pave the way for allowing uh, these changes when it comes to reentry voting.
So the next step is policy implementation. I think we talked a lot about that, kind of how a lot of people in Montana and like especially like guaranteeing the right to vote. So when those felons walk out that jail door, they're being reintegrated back into society, which is a really important part about rehabilitation and
Mm-hmm.
kind of paying for your crime.
Yeah.
Uh, so for the fifth step of the policy analysis, my personal opinion is that every citizen deserves the right to vote, whether or not they're in jail, whether or not they're out of jail, but they've committed a crime or anything like that. I think that if you're a contributing member of society, and I think that includes people in jail, that you should be able to vote, and this right shouldn't be infringed on. I think in special underlying circumstances, like if you've committed treason or if you have attempted to commit election fraud, those are circumstances that allow the government to take away your right to vote. But I think in other circumstances, you should keep this super sacred American right, and you should be able to still have this right to vote. So that wraps up my policy analysis essay. I'd love to give a huge shout out to Bryce Bennett. He's an awesome senator. He does a ton of good work, and it was really enjoyable chatting with him. It was really hard to cut down our like 40-minute interview to just the 6 to 8 minutes, but he's awesome. He does a lot of good work, and he really specializes in voting rights and does a great job in it. So thank you, Bryce.